How's that? Everyone can hear that all right? Is it super loud or not too loud or it's good? Way too loud. Hold about here. That's feeling good? Okay, awesome. Hey, everyone. My name's Zachary Cooper. I'm a legal scholar from the Amsterdam Law and Technology Institute over in Amsterdam, right? And basically, I'm going to be speaking today to a paper we just wrote about techno-regulatory coherence and techno-regulatory incoherence. This is when the law and technologies work together and can make sense, and when the law and technology works together and they don't make any sense and the law just doesn't work, and how private actors can exploit that nonsense so that the law will never be able to apply to them. So, what am I talking about? All right, prediction. Okay, everybody's predicting everything. Everything is predicting everyone. So all your ads are trying to guess, what you want. Large language models are predicting what words should come next for things to make sense. Your smart cars and your smart toasters and your smart vibrators even now, they have smart vibrators. All of them are talking to each other and they're correlating the frequency of your orgasms with your preferences for peanut butter. And they're trying to work out if there's some hidden pattern there that makes you more likely to watch Lord of the Rings, right? And so everyone's looking for these hidden patterns that we don't realize to find, trying to find some great logic that's going to govern our lives, right? But the thing is, with predictability is always going to come some sense of control, right? Because it's creating one dominant technological narrative, right? So the question is, who actually has the capacity to escape that control of the kind of grand predictive logic that's meant to control us, and how are they going to do so? So the main regulatory power that's supposed to control what we can and can't do is the law, right? And all these techno-architectures that are controlling our behavior are themselves also supposed to come under the remit of the law, right? But to kind of us, the sort of lowly consumer, they're both essentially regulatory architectures that are controlling our behavior, that are controlling what we do, the law and the technologies. But here's the thing. If everything's becoming so ordered and predictable, forming this kind of grand, coherent logic that's meant to be governing our lives, well, theoretically, one would expect that would make everything kind of easier to regulate, right? But actually, our techno-society is becoming progressively more incoherent. It's getting harder and harder to apply. Can everyone hear me all right? No, I guess. Okay. It's getting harder and harder to apply our public legal principles to our behavior through these new techno-architectures. So people sometimes refer to this as the law like lagging behind because there's a new technology, but that suggests this kind of linearity to this whole thing, whereas actually something much more fragmented is going on here. Let me give you an example of incoherence. So let's call this the publica Act of 2024. What if you had a law where the law was just right? Now, if that's too abstract, maybe something a little more tangible. What about Article 2? What if you had a law that said, okay, both of Zach's bodies must be hyper-painted prior to sonic registration at the Republica conference during the bass guitar solo? Now, in a very real way, and to my own shame, I haven't exactly followed that law today, right? But I haven't really broken the law either. The law itself is just kind of garbled gibberish, right? Well, that's basically what happens to an enormous amount of our current law whenever a new technology comes along, when you try to apply the law as it stands to the new technology. You've got a bunch of words, but the words don't line up. So in as much as the law is this kind of regulatory architecture to control our behavior, and then all the code on our, all the apps you're using is a regulatory architecture trying to control your behavior, when the things make sense, we call that techno-regulatory coherence, right? But when the things don't line up and it just becomes both of Zach's bodies must be hyper-painted, so there's some new technology comes along, everyone goes, ha-ha, the law doesn't work anymore. Now we can do whatever we want on this little technology because they don't understand how to use the law, right? So the law might still be there, but it just may not make sense anymore, like this La Publica law. Or sometimes it might nominally make sense, like all the words will line up, the words will make sense, but they no longer achieve their objective anymore. So there was a lot of discourse around this when the internet first showed up is the really obvious example, right? Because suddenly none of the law really functioned anymore. So, we had all these laws around like advertising in public spaces. We had to restrict advertising within public spaces, right? And then this enterprising pornographer came along and invented pop-up ads. And suddenly all the laws about like not going into public space didn't work and you could just get spammed with billions of things, right? Or we had a whole corpus of telecommunications law, and then an enterprising pornographer showed up and invented live streaming, and then none of the law really worked for that anymore. Or recently, right, we have a lot of revenge porn laws about like uploading non-consensual imagery of people, and then an enterprising pornographer came along and invented deep fakes, and it didn't really work anymore. So you're kind of always trying to stay one step ahead of these kind of enterprising pornographers, basically. But basically, the law essentially needed to change to support the internet, right? So that the words lined up. And then in other ways, once the law had changed to support the internet needed to change to support the law so it wasn't illegal. And so, like lovers in the night, they've sort of slowly come towards each other until now they're one in union and everything is making sense, right? Here's the thing though. Any techno-architecture or any law is inherently going to serve certain ideologies, right? So that might be by design. So if you look at something like the blockchain, it had a whole manifesto to it, it had a whole white paper. Whenever people are trying to, administer the blockchain, or whenever the communities are discussing the blockchain, they're trying to work out how best to develop the technology in line with these certain ideologies around decentralizing finance, right? So that's an ideology by design baked into the thing. On the other side of the spectrum, right, you've got like machine learning tools where even though lots of people are talking about AI, they're talking about how best, they're trying to work out what are the ideologies we want to underpin this thing. There's all kinds of ideologies that the technology serves that were not by design, that were just circumstantial. So when you use AI in employment and it turns out to be massively racist and massively sexist, that's not something they tried to make the AI racist and sexist, but somehow through just using the machine learning tool, it's ended up serving a different ideology. So what this means is that even if you're trying to do the same task you were doing before, but you're using a different technology to do it, fundamentally the ideology served in pursuit of that same task might have radically shifted without that being your intention, right? The law is essentially the same, right? So when you change the law so that it functions now for some new technology, you might just think, all right, we're just bringing the law up to speed so that it works with the new technology. But actually, in making it coherent with that new technology, that new techno-regulatory coherence might now serve something wholly other in line with the ideologies that are supported by the technology, right? Let me give you a very contemporary current example of this. So right now you could use machine learning, you can use AI-generated tools, generative AI tools, to just bang out millions of songs, millions of pictures, millions of paintings, millions of what have you, right? So we have this nice old copyright regime, intellectual property regime for dealing with this. Now, the whole purpose of copyright, right? There's a few objectives to copyright. One is to protect the dignity of its creator, that they should get kind of control over their creative output. Another one is to stimulate innovation. There's this foundational economic theory that underpins copyright, which is that, no rational actor is going to invest in creation if they're not able to get a monopoly over the thing that they create. It's a debated theory because obviously people have been creating things since the dawn of time without receiving copyright. So maybe that's a side note not worth dwelling upon. But it is the foundational theory is that people aren't going to spend a lot of time building something if they can't then control the output of what they make, right? But the main objective really of copyright is to stimulate a competitive market, right? So really what the theory is saying, I'm going to spend 10 years working on a novel, and then when they've finished writing their novel for 10 years, anyone can just go and make money off that novel instead of them, right? Well, now if you can just generate infinite amounts of content at essentially no cost, if you get ownership of that content and no one can touch it, and all I've got to do is go, make me 1 million hours of songs about birds, right? Well, the law is no longer really protecting the labor of the creative that's created. Now the law is kind of incentivizing some sort of creativity mining or copy mining so that, then I can find bloody Taylor Swift and I can go, your new song sounds an awful lot like hour number 712 of my bird opus, like, pay up, I wrote that friggin' melody, right? So that's why the US Copyright Office came out and went, no, none of that. You can't just own all this random crap that you generate. But then the problem with that is, well then, what are we going to do with all the stuff that people generate? I mean, once all the artists are using generation as a part of their practice, they've generated some parts, they haven't generated other parts, well then what's the deal? They now just don't own any of their work? Well, that's not really stimulating a market. That's fundamentally denying the existence of a market around these things. It's not really stimulating innovation. You're telling people they can't use the most new, the hottest new innovative tools to make stuff. So, what if you do in a few years, everyone's generating everything as a part of their creative practice. Now what? Now just nobody owns anything that they make. You have no ownership of creative materials. Well, then why even have the law in the first place? Plus, how the hell are you even going to work out what people have generated, what they haven't generated? You're going to audit every single thing that every artist does to check which bit they generated and which they didn't. That's impossible. So it's a really kind of perfect example how even though the US Copyright Office is trying to maintain the status quo, they're trying to apply the law as conservatively as possible to keep things the way that it was, and the law makes sense, and the technology works, it makes sense, in establishing that techno-regulatory coherence by being super conservative about it and going, let's just keep things the same. actually the ideologies being served in the application of that law to the technology have been radically reoriented. It's fundamentally serving wholly other ideologies to those that the original purpose of the law was there for, right? So that relationship of mutual objective is going to be relevant between every single techno-architecture and the law. But then it's most readily relevant in the actual use of technology in the administration of justice, which is to say the functionality of the law is morphing to suit these technologies, but we're also seeing now just direct entrenchment of technologies within the administration of justice, within the public court systems. This is the very fast-growing field of law technology, right? Generally, private companies developing algorithmic tools to assist with the automated administration of justice. And of course, that administration of justice, although it's ostensibly in pursuit of the same objective it was in pursuit of before it used the technologies, is now going to be foundationally changed through the fact that it's using these different technologies. The kind of really classic illustrative example of this was the Compass system, which I think they've now rebranded as the North Point suite, probably due to some pretty negative press, right? Which was basically a predictive tool for recidivism, basically how likely criminals are to reoffend, right? And they wanted to use it for help in sentencing and bail and parole, but obviously, if you're using an algorithmic tool, only factors which can be turned into like clear, hard, cold data are going to be able to be processed algorithmically, and then only those data points which can be directly correlated with like clear real-world outcomes are going to end up assuming any importance. So what that meant is that even though they tried feeding a whole bunch of information into these algorithms, basically they ended up reducing their assessments around sentencing and bail to this much, much, much smaller amount of factors. It basically just came down to prior criminal history. And the prediction tool was, I guess, predictably very racist as well. False positives were disproportionately black, false negatives were disproportionately white. So you can see the functionality of the justice is completely changed just through the fact that you're using a different technology to do it, right? And that's most troubling, obviously, when you just don't understand how the tech works, which is the case with a lot of new machine learning tools because we can't see inside them, right? In the meantime, the actual importance of that state justice architecture is itself just diminishing because more and more of our behavior is just being regulated by the technologies themselves, which is to say, because we're doing everything in-app, within the technologies, within these techno environments, when we have a dispute within the techno environments, we just deal with them in-app, usually by these private, confidential dispute resolution tools. Let me give you an example. Let's say I want to buy some hot new like smart bass guitar, right? Which maybe claims that it can track my bass guitar playing and keep, build a personalized profile of my bass guitar playing and give me personalized statements, being like, keep going, Zach, on a Wednesday or whatever, based on the profile it's developed for me, right? Let's go on eBay. I buy some smart bass guitar off like some guy in Estonia. My bass guitar shows up, I'm trying to play it, and it's going, keep going, Zach, keep going, Zach. But I feel like the bass guitar is spying on me because I'm just trying to play that funky music, white boy. But then whenever I go on Spotify, it's recommending play that funky music, white boy to me. I'm getting on YouTube, it's telling me to watch live videos of play that funky music, white boy to me. The bass guitar's humming all day, going, keep going, Zach, keep going, Zach. And I'm like, I hate this smart bass guitar. I got to get rid of it. It's not working the way I wanted it to. What am I going to do, right? I message the Estonian guy that sold it to me. This smart bass guitar sucks. He never messages me back. What do? Do I, A, launch a civil claim in the Estonian civil legal justice system from my bedroom in Melbourne, Australia? Or B, do I click the, oi, my bass guitar sucked button on eBay, like fix it, this guy never responded to my messages button, right? And that's what we all do. If you've got an issue with your Uber, you're like, this guy sucked, or your Amazon order didn't work, you're like, this Amazon order sucked, or your Airbnb host has screwed you and there was no key there, you're like, the Airbnb sucked, or maybe your entire business that you run on TikTok has just been randomly pulled down and your entire livelihood has been removed from you. You go to the TikTok app, you're like, oi, that was my whole friggin' business, and you click the button, right? Maybe when you click that fix this button, what happens in the background is broadly going to mirror public legal norms. Maybe what's going to happen is going to be halfway similar to what a judge would have done if you'd taken this into a, public legal center. But For all you know, they got one of those, I don't know, those psychic octopuses that, predict football winners, that just like chooses whether you get your money back. Or maybe it just checks your desirability score on your dating apps. And, if you're handsome enough, then I get my bass guitar back. And if I'm not handsome enough, I don't. I got no bloody idea, right? So what you see is this privatization of justice, right? This privatization of dispute resolution. Now, one might expect that public judicial systems are not going to be happy about this shift of power towards these private architectures, right? But actually, for the same reason that they're interested in just entrenching all of these new technologies in their administration of justice, namely that they're notoriously overburdened, they're actually very happy to try to outsource as much stuff out of the court systems as possible, right? In fact, they've long incentivized out-of-court settlements, right? So actually, many courts are enacting higher and higher thresholds just to have your case heard, within a court at all, which has led legal scholars Linda Mulcahy and Simon Roberts to say that judges are now no more than exemplary ceremonial figures who legitimate other people's decision-making, or in this case, other codes' decision-making, and that civil justice services are going to be used only by those prepared to pay for it. And this kind of support from public regulators, what that means is that private companies are actually incentivized to develop cheap and efficient algorithmic tools that will enact the administration of justice privately without ever needing to actually emulate the public system, nor to try to predict or aspire to its likely outcomes. So, within that context, right, where we got these fast developing new technologies at this seemingly exponential rate, and the law is constantly trying to change itself so that it makes sense to the new technology, but then it's also incorporating these new technologies that it may or may not fully understand into its own, enactment of public justice, in the meantime, while also just outsourcing stuff that it used to do to private architectures to be dealt with privately. What we're seeing is that this new techno-regulatory coherence, the relationship between the law and the technology, is really seeing a major relinquishing of public regulatory power to private technological architectures. Despite this, we haven't thrown in the towel just yet. We do want to have some control over these private architectures. We don't want to not have any kind of public legal regulatory system, but our ability to control them, our public legal regulatory coherence, is constantly being challenged with the arrival of these new techno-architectures that each have their own little technologics that no longer make sense. So how do we deal with this? Well, regulation is constantly trying to future-proof itself by being tech-neutral. That means by applying to all technology, which is to say, we're trying to draft stuff broadly enough that when there's some hot new technology that waltzes into town, we don't have to go back and rewrite all the bloody laws that we wrote yesterday, right? But that's a fine art, because if you draft it too broadly, if you draft a law that's don't do bad stuff no matter what the technology, well, then that doesn't really work. There's heaps of legal interpretation by judges and lawyers. But if you draft it too specifically, if you draft it too narrowly, then it's really easy for some new technology to show up, and now none of the words line up anymore, and none of it really makes sense, right? So that's been this persistent issue with tech-neutral legislation. So, for example, people spent heaps of time on the new AI Act, and they thought it was ready to go. They went, this is looking nice. And then ChatGPT came out, and they went, oh, actually, we hadn't even considered generative AI systems. And they had to go back and quickly lump in a few clauses that made sense about generative AI systems, right? So as technology is getting more sophisticated, it's getting easier and easier to just develop a technology that sort of escapes the control of the law just by operating differently, just by functioning differently. So a really good example of this is the classic piece of tech-neutral legislation. This is the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR 2018. Some of you might have had to deal with this. Now, this might look like a just very bland, dry piece of law, but when this showed up 5-6 years ago, this was the hottest piece of new law on the block. People were going goo goo gaga for this hot new law, right? And the reason everyone was going goo goo gaga for this hot new law, right, was because at the time everyone was getting very nervous about their data, very nervous about data protection, and this was the law that was meant to give you control, so that all these big tech companies could stop just selling your data and handing it off to advertisers and using your data to control your behavior, using your data to predict what you're going to do. This was no. You've got all these rights about your data, and the data controllers, the people that control your data, they got heaps of obligations to you. They can't just hand out your data willy-nilly to anybody, right? Now, since this was Europe's flagship data protection law, it was extremely important that this was tech neutral, because we didn't want some hot new technology waltzing around the block and all of a sudden we got to rewrite the whole bloody thing, right? So it didn't matter if your data was written on a tissue by someone and shoved into a drawer. GDPR still applied to that tissue, right? They had obligations over what they wrote down on that tissue. Problem was, despite future-proofing the law, immediately a bunch of technology was developed that helped get around the law. So tech that very literally exploited incoherence in the form of, it literally turned your data into nonsense in the form of encryption, right? Turned all your data into gibberish. So you've probably seen on your WhatsApp or whatever, they're going, hey, we're encrypting everything here to protect your privacy, right? Actually, what they're doing is, through the use of these very sophisticated encryption tools, they now are able to just garble all your data up into mush. They can do that locally on your own device so that no one needs to look at it. They can aggregate that with a bunch of other encrypted data. They can do all the same predictions, do all the same behavioral feedback stuff. They can feed it all back to you without ever needing to look at your data, and then your privacy is preserved, but now none of these pesky laws really apply anymore, right? So that's great for a bunch of reasons for big tech, because now if the cops want to look at their platforms because like they should have moderated against, I don't know, a bunch of neo-Nazis or some other horrible stuff, or maybe their competitors like want to look at it, the competitors, or maybe like researchers want access to it, they can now just go, hey, it's all encrypted, it's all private, we couldn't look at it even if we wanted to, right? So in the meantime, you're still being geotagged through your Wi-Fi, all your keystrokes are still being tracked on your phone, but it's now all just being pulled into all this confidential gibberish, gets run through some machine learning system that's an opaque black box. Large advertising platforms are developing new systems so they can target all that same advertising, all that same behavioral modeling at you, so they never need to look at like any of the data. And now, even though the law is nominally coherent, you can apply it. Actually, now it's just kind of quite a nice buffer, because smaller actors who don't have access to all this sophisticated encryption technology, they've now got all these bloody obligations that they've got to like go by, while those with the better tech can essentially do the same thing they were doing before that we wrote the law to protect you against, but they can do it now legally, right? So tech neutrality has been kind of quite easily shirked here, but actually it wasn't even really tech neutral to begin with, because even though it worked for the tissue in the drawer, it was actually already gibberish if you tried to apply it to like the blockchain, for example. So that was like a whole bunch of reasons, but I'll just give you a couple to give you a sense. I mean, you had straight down the line ideological incoherence. For example, like the GDPR gives you a right to be forgotten. That means someone can't just hold onto your data indefinitely for forever. The blockchain has the immutability principle. Like things need to stay on the blockchain forever for everybody to be able to see them, right? Then on the other hand, you had just functional incoherence. Like the GDPR is completely built off this notion that data controllers have obligations towards you, right? Whereas the blockchain is completely decentralized. So when your data goes up, who's got the obligation to you? Everyone on the blockchain? No one on the blockchain? So neither make any sense whatsoever. So if we return to the Republica law from the beginning, that's basically what we have here. If you go to apply the GDPR to the blockchain, it's just gibberish. Like none of the words line up with the way that the technology works, right? So it's really hard to write a law that can apply to everything. So what's the plan here? Well, I was talking to a colleague of mine who had some involvement with the drafting of the GDPR, and he went, it's never going to matter because the bloody blockchain, it's never going to catch on. It's never going to replace the financial system. NFTs are never going to replace art. And I thought, exactly, haha. That's the whole problem, right? The whole problem with the it's never going to replace anything argument is that non-replacement is the whole issue. What creates techno-regulatory coherence is replacement. New technology comes along, it replaces the way the old technology works. Now we rewrite the law, the new law comes along to change the old law, and everything works together. It's when something comes along that doesn't replace the other thing that we're using, but it's there and it just sticks around, that's when it's a real issue, because actually rewriting laws is a huge pain in the ass, right? You got this extremely sophisticated, complicated framework, and if the law is working for most stuff, like all the most prominent frameworks, we don't really want to have to change everything just to facilitate this weird little fringe architecture that not that many people are using, right? Because we've gone to all this effort to get them to come towards each other, right? But the more that we put those things together, the denser that web of techno-legal coherence, the harder it is to change it again just for some other thing that's totally functionally different. So the more fringe that architecture, the more abstract or weird it is, the less people are using it, the more we're going to go, let's just kind of ignore that kind of weird one on the side because we don't want to like unsettle the grand balance of everything else. So here we are 5-6 years later. Blockchain, still there, man. It's still kicking. It's not the hottest new technology on the block anymore. Everyone's looking at AI, but it's there. GDPR, still there. They still don't make any sense. They're all just kind of scuttling on in like feigned ignorance of one another, looking the other way, right? So what you see is that if you actively abstract legal regulatory norms, we all just go, I don't really want to have to deal with that if I don't have to. The really good example of that was the DAO, the Decentralized Autonomous Organization on the blockchain in 2016. So the DAO was an organization, if you don't know, it was based on the blockchain. They had their own tokens, DAO tokens. They were linked to voting power within the organization. Now, when users found a vulnerability in the blockchain code, they stole millions of dollars worth of ETH, right? For the public legal system to engage with that theft, it would have to work out like, what the hell is even a DAO? Is it an organization? I guess. Is it a company? Not really. Are they stocks, the DAO tokens? Not really. Are they cryptocurrencies? Yeah, but are they currencies? Not really. There's so much law that needs to apply if you call it any of those things, but none of the company law really works because it's not a company. None of the financial law really works because it's not a currency. So for them to even start to work out what to do with the theft, you've got to work out what all those things are. Whatever you decide on that is going to change the functionality of all that other law. It's going to change your corporate law, it's going to change your financial law, and it's just for this stupid DAO that they don't care about. So what do? They just went, even though millions of dollars had been stolen, they kind of went, I don't know what to do with that. So what happened? The community just privately resolved the issue. They hard forked the blockchain, they coded their tokens back in, they coded their millions back, and the public systems just went, all right, you guys seem happy now, you kind of did a bunch of coding and you're all happy now, right? So what this reveals is this core issue, right? So as long as you can intelligently design an architecture that's not illegal, but just inherently completely abstract in its functionality, it will leave it more sovereign, more ungovernable. But the problem is if we keep developing these techno-architectures abstractly by design, we ignore the blockchain, but then someone comes up with a post-blockchain, or someone comes up with some weird self-governing AI architecture that sorts itself, and we just sort of allow them all to coexist because we value them all independently, or we're just afraid to destabilize our broad, techno-regulatory framework. We reach this kind of just mad regulatory confusion where all the architectures are supporting different norms and the public regulatory system can't understand them. Because while it's outsourcing all of its power to the private architectures, it's putting private architectures in its own administration of justice, we might end up with this complete diffraction of norms, a complete diffraction of purpose, privatization of the law, and just pure regulatory chaos, right? So I'll end on this. Herein you find this inherent utility of incoherence, where you can basically escape the control of the law through abstracting norms. And we're already seeing a lot of abstracting. So now we've seen value abstracted so much, like what can you even purchase anymore? Like the notion of what you can purchase has been so abstracted. Currency, we've seen abstracted with cryptocurrencies. Are they or are they not? We've seen abstraction of governance organizations with the DAO, but also just in fan and gaming communities now. You have these weird pseudo-official groups that are very lucrative, but they don't officially work for Magic the Gathering, but they might be responsible for the movement of millions of dollars, but they're not the official Magic the Gathering company. And we're fast entering this world where, I guess, theoretically, you can buy a probability of receiving an unofficial pseudo-job, pseudo-governance position in a quasi-community, quasi-company that's... let me give you this example that I wrote out here. Don't just play, rule. For just 5,000 Z-Tox, you could buy a 15% chance of joining Tier X of the next Z committee, where you can fight other committee members in a part gamified world to the death for voting power in determining what happens next in Zach world. Win battles or just make interesting decisions for a chance to earn more Z-Tox. But watch out, because you never know when the wrath of the Zods will randomly change everything. How do we regulate that? What are the laws around that? None of that makes sense, but it could be a real thing. So, okay. All right, I'll say one last sentence. So despite everything being totally ostensibly predictable now, weirdly enough, no one basically understands how anything actually works. From the locked-in hardware of your phone, to the functions of the operating systems, to the closed-source, pre-compiled apps on your phone, then the locked-door cloud services, all the data is stored on. Whoever controls these architectures controls the power. And we do not know how much control we'll have over what is to come, but this exploitation of techno-regulatory incoherence, something we've got to be extremely conscious of, otherwise we may find ourselves beholden to a new corpus of law, which is just all trade secrets, all privately owned, which will challenge our political power and our autonomy. Thank you very much. Cheers.